Good evening. I'm Steve Edwards, the Executive Director of the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, and I wish this event had garnered more interest. It's fantastic to see such a packed audience for what we know will be a terrific conversation tonight. And before we get into a formal introduction for tonight's event featuring Ta-Nehisi Coates and the Cates for Reparations, I want to make a special thanks to all of our partners here who helped make tonight's event possible. The International House, which is hosting us tonight, this is part of their Global Voices series. Our friends at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, and the National Public Housing Museum. Please join me in giving them a warm round of applause for all of this. Thank you. Now, I think many journalists, many writers will spend their entire career hoping to have the kind of impact cumulatively that Ta-Nehisi has had in just his time as a writer, but particularly in one article in the June issue of The Atlantic. The Case for Reparations, 15,000 words, set deeply here in Chicago, spanning hundreds of years of history, took a topic that for so many of us had been marginalized, historicized, and largely absent from the public conversation, and put it front and center. To put some perspective on the kind of energy and conversation that this triggered, not only in evidence here tonight by all of you here, more online visitors read that article in a single day than any previous Atlantic magazine story. And we're talking about a publication with a 150-plus year history. The June issue sold 60% more copies on the newsstand than its counterpart the same year ago. And in more than 200 events that we've been able to host here in our short 2 years on campus at the Institute of Politics, this has been without question one of the most anticipated conversations tonight. This is part of our series of events where we hope to elevate and expand the public conversation. We'll be taking a brief hiatus, as all of you do, for Thanksgiving, and then back at it the first week of December. We will have a conversation that will focus on national security, featuring the Washington Post's David Ignatius, also former Congresswoman Jane Harman, and former U.S. Ambassador to NATO Ivo Dalder. That will take place on Thursday the 4th. You can find out more about that event and all of our other events at politics.uchicago.edu. Tonight's event is being live streamed and recorded for podcast. You can check out all of our podcasts on iTunes by subscribing to UChicago IOP. And you can also follow us on Twitter at UChiPolitics. Finally, during our conversation tonight, we will, as is customary at the Institute of Politics, open the floor to your questions. And we ask, though, that when you do, we're going to expand, actually, the time for questions tonight, just given the size of this audience, and I know the interest that many of you will have in joining the conversation. But to accommodate as many of you as possible, we ask that you keep the questions short and to the point. We ask that they actually be a question. And the moderator has reserved the right to sort of cut you off if that's not the case. And in keeping with the university's values, we also ask that you uphold those standards of inquiry and civility and open discourse. I'm here to formally introduce our speakers on our program tonight is Anastasia Kaiser. She's a fourth year at the university, majoring in economics and public policy. She's a member of our student executive board. And tonight's event may not have happened if it weren't for her. We have a proposal process where students actually can suggest speakers and programs that the Institute will bring to campus. And she brought the Ta-Nehisi Coates suggestion through our proposal process. I'm proud to say, even before the Case for Reparations cover story. Please join me in welcoming Anastasia Kaiser to the podium.
Tonight, we are incredibly fortunate to be joined by James Bennett, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and by Ta-Nehisi Coates, a senior editor and writer for The Atlantic, to talk about Ta-Nehisi's powerful piece, The Case for Reparations, which most of you are holding and which all of you should read. The article, which was published in the June 2014 issue of The Atlantic and is set mostly in Chicago, was the product of 2 years of reporting and was released to overwhelming reader response and to overwhelming critical praise. The case for reparations argues that long after slavery ended in America, decades of racist policies and deliberate injustices, from redlining to Jim Crow, have systematically wronged generations of African Americans, and that, quote, until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be whole. Ta-Nehisi Coates is currently the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Visiting Scholar at MIT, where he teaches a class on writing and journalism. In 2008, he published The Beautiful Struggle, a memoir about growing up in West Baltimore. And when I told people that I would be introducing Ta-Nehisi tonight, 3 of them said to me separately, he's one of the people in America I admire the most, and he's maybe one of the most admired journalists of our time. James Bennett is the 14th editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. Prior to joining the magazine in 2006, he was the Jerusalem bureau chief for the New York Times. Both of these figures are incredibly inspiring to me as an aspiring journalist. So I hope you join me in giving a very warm welcome to our 2 distinguished guests this evening, James Bennett and Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve and Anastasia. And I'd like to say thank you to the Institute of Politics for having us out, and International House for hosting us tonight. And thank you to all of you for being here. Ta-Nehisi struck a very, very deep chord with this piece, and it's a wonderful compliment and testament to the power of his work. That you're all here. We're gonna talk for maybe a half hour at the start and then open it up to questions from you guys. We'd like to get to as many as we can about this story or about other subjects Ta-Nehisi's been writing about that might be on your minds, from Bill Cosby to Ferguson to what it's like to learn French at his advancing age. But first, we're going to show a video that The Atlantic did to accompany this piece. And so, Ta-Nehisi, maybe you should set up the video, talk a little bit about what people are going to see.
Well, you know, one of the cool things about working on the case for reparations is shortly after I, presented the idea to my editors, including James, there was this immediate feeling that this was the sort of piece that we could approach in a multimedia sort of way. So if you look at how the case for reparations looks online, The Atlantic puts tremendous amount of resources into, all of its stories. Anytime you see, like a big feature like that, what's behind that is, a lot of hard work in terms of editing, a lot of hard work in terms of fact checking, a lot of hard work in terms of copy editing, a lot of hard work in terms of reporting and writing, resources. But I think, there was some feeling among folks at The Atlantic that, more resources could be put in another direction, and that was to create a multimedia feel for the story. So if you read it online, you can see we have maps of Chicago, for instance, that reflect the redlining. That's, a big part of it. You can see that we have, primary text that you can look at when we're talking about the period of enslavement in this country. You can even see the original piece that we did, that we didn't even know we had done until we started researching this, but that we had done on North Lawndale and contract buying. And,
in 1972.
In 1972. In 1972, and so it was, quite a joy to be able to come back, to North Lawndale and write about the neighborhood and, revisit the issue. And one of the ways we did it is in this film, which profiles the Contract Buyers League. And this is, tremendously important to me because what it shows is that, you can talk about, the boot on the neck, of African Americans in a city like Chicago or nationally. But the other side of that is people who are struggling against. There's always a struggle, against it. So this video is very much about that struggle.
The question of housing is one of the major problems this country faces. By and large, blacks live in substandard housing. Those who manage to fight their way out of it frequently pay a large penalty to do so.
I came from Birmingham, Alabama, but I came to Chicago for a better living and a job. I bought here, this house, in '58. It ain't nothing to brag about, but it's mine.
My name is Clyde Ross. I was born in Clarksville, Mississippi. I bought this house in 1958.
I moved in this house in 1957. It was mostly a white area, and when they said that the niggers was coming, they didn't say black, they said the niggers was coming. And they just start moving away. Mostly everyone that was black, they had been sold a contract. If you missed the payment in 3 months, they could take the property back. No lawyer, no nothing could help you. That was it.
There are blocks like this scattered throughout the Lawndale section of Chicago's West Side Ghetto. The people who live here bought their homes from real estate speculators at double or triple their value, and they bought on contract because they couldn't get conventional or FHA mortgages. Under the contract, the buyer makes installment payments at high interest, but he bills no equity. If he defaults on even one payment at any time during the contract, he loses the property and everything he's paid into it.
Go pay $26,000, and the house was worth $12,000. That means I was overcharged quite a bit, and the contract situation was so bad until whenever something broke down, you had to fix it. You had to pay your water and gas and electric and the taxes and everything else, but you didn't have no ownership.
How could we be charged like that if that wasn't a law? And how would the law let them do this? But they said it was their property. They had a choice to sell it at whatever price they wanted to. And if you bought it, then that was on you.
Worked 3 jobs. I worked at Campbell Soup, post office, and I delivered pizzas for 4 to 5 years. I get home at 10 o'clock every night, leave home at 6 o'clock every morning. Kids be asleep, they don't see me. And when they did see me on the weekends, I tell them something, they look at their mama and say, well, should I do it or should I not? Who is this guy, I was a stranger in my own home because of this contract thing. Really a stranger. I said, this is not gonna work. These people who have cheated us out of more than money, we have been cheated out of the right to be human beings in a society. We have been cheated out of buying homes at a decent price. Now it's time now. We got a chance now. The Contract Buyers League have presented a chance for these people in this area to move out of this grip of society, to move up, stand on your own 2 feet, be human beings, fight for what you know is right. Fight!
I really believe that, ultimately what we're after is some kind of communication among human beings, but that can only be affected when people can approach each other on the basis of equality.
Yeah, but even though you are keeping within the law, this is really war, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
The college students and I went up and down the streets and asked people if they bought on contract. And we discovered that the average overcharge was $10,000 and then computed the monthly payments so that we knew that black folks were paying a race tax of about $20,000 per family.
You would just go to their house and ask them, is you on a contract? Some of them say, I don't know. Some of them didn't want to talk to you. And they would say, no, I'm on a mortgage. But when they bring the paper, I knew it wasn't no mortgage because that's what I had, a piece of paper. Everybody practically was on contract.
People on the west side and the south side were being blamed for things that were not of their own making. This is the best example I can think of institutional racism. White folks created the ghetto. And it drives me crazy today even that we don't admit that.
The people of Lawndale organized the Contract Buyers League, and during the past year, the league began urging large numbers of buyers to withhold the payments on their contracts. By withholding the payments, the league has managed to renegotiate, enabling the buyer to build equity and saving him an average of $10,000.
There were 550 families in the payment strike. People knew how to handle pickets. People knew how to handle you telling their neighbors. But when you're hitting them in the pocketbook with a payment strike, that was serious business.
They said, well, you got to pay this money, it's $260 every month. Nah, we ain't paying you nothing until you get this contract right.
They came up, rang the bell, still in bed, and the wife went to the door. They served her with a paper, and then they came on in.
What did they say to you?
They said they were going to Victor's.
And where's your furniture now?
Out on the street.
What do you plan to do? Do you believe that you should forward it and pay it like you were doing before?
No, I won't. I won't give them the money.
We just wanted to get a fair price for the house, you know, and we wanted the mortgage where we could have ownership of the house. And the contract buyers brought us to a point where we could understand that we could do something about this.
The peoples of CBL have come together. No matter what happened, we are fighting for one thing, that is justice. And believe me, as long as we stick together and keep growing in large numbers like we done now, something got to happen.
I've always wanted to own my own house because I worked for white people when I was in the South, and they had beautiful homes. And I always said one day I was going to have me one. And I finally did.
The house was paid for. No more fright of losing it. It felt good. It really felt good.
Before we actually plunge into the discussion, two of the heroes of that story are actually with us tonight, Clyde Ross and Jack McNamara. Gentlemen, would you mind standing, please? How do you interpret that video in the end? Is that a story of triumph or despair?
It's funny you asked that. Because even as I was watching it, it bothers me a little bit. I mean, no disrespect to Kashi, who's our genius, video editor. Obviously, I'm happy, for the great work, Jack did, for Mr. Ross, for his, ridiculous, incredible, almost superhuman determination. I have, no problem saying that in that situation, I would have lost my home. And I don't think that's, a particularly shameful thing. The people that you saw, and I was aware of this, and, I think, Mr. Ross and everybody who went through this, were aware of the stories that you hear about heroism. These are the exceptional people. The vast majority of black people, though, and, this can never be forgotten, the vast majority of black people are ordinary. Just like the vast majority of humanity is ordinary. Most people are not going to be able to work, 3 different jobs at the same time, in order to hold on to their homes. It's just not, within the normal human, range of capacity. And so most people in that situation, in that system, did lose their homes. We had that note at the end, but they did lose their home, and other people, were enriched because of that. And so I think the video is very, very important because I think, obviously Mr. Ross, I think Ms. Weatherspoon, I think Ms. Lewis, I think Jack, I think all of the work that they put in, all the work of the Contract Buyers League, it deserves, recognition and deserves that great, standing applause that folks just gave. But at the same time, I don't want people to watch that video and walking away with this kind of smug happiness that, for instance, we often have about the civil rights movement. This need to give ourselves, prizes and awards because somebody, through a struggle that they should not have had to, wage in the first place. Never forget that. Never forget that it was unjust that, Mr. Ross had to work 3 jobs in the first place. Managed to do it. It's, I think about, just a quick digression. I was watching a documentary on the Freedom Riders a while back. And actually 2 weeks ago, not a while back, 2 weeks ago. Not that long ago. Because, what that is going to flatter what I'm about. It's going to flatter me a little bit too much. So I thought about the Freedom Riders, and my understanding was the Freedom Riders, that they had gone south and they were trying to, integrate interstate, bus lines and integrate, the waiting areas and everything, that they were actually trying to affect a change of law. What I did not realize was that, in fact, segregation by letter of the law was illegal at that point. The Supreme Court had already ruled on it. And what the Freedom Riders were actually trying to do was to get the federal government to enforce the law as it was. And that, and to see that, and then, to see Bobby Kennedy and the way that, he assaulted them in the press, to see, how, for President Kennedy, how, they were just basically, a pain, in the rear end. And you think about that, and yet everybody wants to be proud about the Freedom Riders today. But how did we as a state regard them in that time? So I think it's very, very important that, we as a country, we as a state, not, use these moments like this, like all of these great anniversaries that we're having right now to give ourselves, too many accolades and to feel too good about it. The fact that Mr. Ross, the fact that, I think the estimate was 85% of African Americans who bought homes during that period were in a contract loan situation was fundamentally unjust. That can never, be made good by the fact that, some folks through their own, ingenuity, through their own dignity, through their own hard work, fought back. The fight itself, that it was brought to them, the war itself, as, Jack talked about in the film, that was brought to them, was fundamentally unjust, and I think, that should always be remembered.
So let's back up a step or so, and why don't you tell the story? How was it that you found yourself in Mr. Ross's living room? Why did you choose to focus on North Lawndale and more broadly Chicago when you were thinking about making the big argument that you were making?
Well, Chicago, as I'm sure most of the people in this room know, is one of the most studied cities in America. Sociology basically got its start right here at the University of Chicago. So beginning from a place of knowing that you're going to have to make a very, very difficult argument for reparations, right? Like most people are not really going to want to hear that. You really need to have as much data as you possibly can. And for Chicago, it's just a wealth of sociological data, and history, frankly, on Chicago. And the great thing about that, though, is that a lot of that reflects nationally. So you can, there are many books, many studies that can tell you about, what redlining was and what its effect was specifically in Chicago. But we know that redlining was a national system. We're very aware of that. So you can, come to a city like Chicago and, render this really, really, deep and detailed story because so many academics, quite frankly, have done so much research before you. And then you can, by that measure, tell the story about the nation as a whole. So the first, that's a long way of saying laziness. That's the first thing. And this is we're working on something else right now, which I won't talk about. But one of the things is, it was like, oh, we can't go back to Chicago again. We can't do that. And one of the things that I haven't said this to you, but one of the things that I'm already facing is that there's just not the same wealth of sociological data that you have in Chicago to make a case. So that was the first thing. The second thing was, in North Lawndale, I read Burl Satter's, tremendous book, which is the history of contract, the contract lending system in North Lawndale specifically. It's a beautiful, beautiful historical work. And even though, Burl doesn't make an argument for reparations in the book, he's very clearly leading that way. It's like an unfinished sentence, And you can say that in a lot of the work about, Chicago, Arnold Hirsch's, work, Making the Second Ghetto. You can see the unfinished sentence, that somebody actually did something, and that there should be some sort of accounting for it. And so she rendered, frankly, North Lawndale so, deep and detailed in that book. And after reading about the system, I believe Burl published a book in like 2004 maybe or something like that. So, I was coming almost 10 years later, and I wondered how many of those people, who might have either been interviewed in her book or who were, around, who had been a part of the Contract Buyers League, who had bought homes in that way, might actually still be alive. Because I thought it was very, very important to not allow people to easy out of saying, well, you're talking about reparations, you're talking about something that happened 150 years ago. No, we are talking about a system of plunder that begins in 1619 and continues up, arguably, if you want to be conservative, until, the 1960s. And that people who went through that are alive, and their children are alive, and we can depict and show, how that works. And so, Burl was very kind, connecting me with Jack, who was, just exceedingly kind with his time, who then connected me with several folks who had been involved in the Contract Buyers League. Mr. Ross was actually lucky enough, was the first person I talked to. And I don't know if I've ever told him, but he was really, really a guiding force in the sense that when I walked in, and I asked him, I said, Mr. Ross, where's your family originally from? And he said, Clarksdale, Mississippi. And I said, well, why did you come to Chicago? And he said to me, well, I was seeking the protection of the law. And I didn't quite understand what he was saying. I asked him again, I said, can you explain that? And he said, well, there were no black lawyers in Clarksdale. There were no black police officers in Clarksdale. There were no black prosecutors in Clarksdale. If you were black in Clarksdale, that meant that there was no law. That meant that people could just come and take things from you. And there was nobody there to protect you. There was nothing to appeal to. And that really, shifted the frame for me. Because traditionally when people talk about the Jim Crow era, as I said, there are all these symbols of civil rights that, people like to, trot out that make us, feel, really, really good about the fact that, we don't have, certain signs up anymore. That's sort of how we see the South. But what Mr. Ross was talking about was, this was engineered anarchy. This was, ruled by, pirates, a bandit class coming in, and taking things from us, and us, being branded effectively outside of society, outside of the protections of society. And so I just, thought, if you could, sort of show that string, all the way from Clarksdale, all the way up to North Lawndale, where you see, a group of people cut out of the usual channels of home buying, and then left to the predation of pirates to do whatever they want to those people, to take from those people, to plunder from those people. I thought it was, just really, really important to show.
One of the amazing things you do in this piece, and I think in all your work, is you have this ability to reach into history and extract news from it, Right. It's our story of ourselves, but we actually don't walk around thinking about it or talking about it. I should have said, actually, it's also true that you come to Chicago just because you like Chicago.
I do come to Chicago because there is that, right?
And so one of the things you do in this piece is show that the reparations conversation has traditionally been dominated in this country by talk about what's owed because of slavery. What you show is actually, no, it's about the denial of the ability to accumulate wealth across generations. Mm-hmm. But you also show that there's a very old tradition of talking about and even paying reparations in the U.S. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, and this is like one of those things where you just have, a hunch as a historian. There's a very beautiful simplicity to a reparations argument that, has reverberation, across history. Laws are passed to keep people from taking things unjustly from other people. And when in the case that, things are taken, we often penalize people, for, repayment. That's just a basic thing that, is as old as human society. And if that's the case, then it can't be as is often presented that, this argument started in 1960. Certainly there was someone who was enslaved and realized that something had been taken from them and that they should get it back. And so I had like this hunch. And then, as soon as I started, calling around and talking to historians, it became clear that, reparations, the argument for reparations is literally as old as the country itself. I was just doing some research. It's funny how things hit you. I was doing some research today, just having this discussion via Twitter, about the roots, of all these Ivy League schools and enslavement, right? And no one knows about this. It's a great book by Craig Wilder, Ebony and Ivy, that explores all of this. And one of the things that people don't know is, the seed money for Harvard Law School goes back to a gentleman by the name of Isaac Royal. Isaac Royal was a big, big slaveholder in the Caribbean and also in Massachusetts. And I didn't make this connection when I had read the story. But Isaac Royal is, turns out to be a royalist. It's funny. Turns out to be a royalist. It's a little bit corny humor for you there. Corny historian humor. Royal was a royalist. You can't, come on, you gotta laugh at that one. Sorry. That was really corny. I'm sorry. And so, he flees after, the revolution. And one of the people who he owns is Belinda Royal, and he leaves all of these, resources aside. And Belinda Royal, with the help of the free African-American population in Boston, in the 18th century, the late 18th century, makes the case. Listen, I was, taken, from Africa at a very, very young age. I was worked all my life. Much of what, this man has accumulated here in Boston is a direct result of my labor. I should get something for that. And crazily enough, she actually does get something. The legislature, passes a pension that they take basically out of the property that Mr. Roy owns, and she actually, gets reparations. We have a whole tradition. The Quakers, for instance, very, very big. Early Quakers in the 18th century, very, very big. It, immediately occurred to them that when you enslave people, everybody knows like the Quakers took this stand against enslavement and said, listen, at least in certain sections of the Quakers, if you're going to hold slaves, you can't be a Quaker anymore. What less people know is that in a lot of the meetings around the states, they also took a stand and said, and not only do you have to free, all the people that you've enslaved, but you actually have to give them things. So there's a history of Quakers paying out reparations. There's a history of even our founding fathers paying out reparations. I want to get this right, but I'm pretty sure that when George Washington, he leaves in his will that all of, the folks that he's enslaved will be emancipated. He doesn't just cut them loose. I want to say this, and forgive me if I'm not getting the figure right, but I believe he gives them 10 acres and leaves, money left aside for their education. So we have a whole history of this. There's a guy we quote, who was president of Yale, who immediately says, listen, to cut these people loose, and just to, leave them into the wild and not do anything for them, is a travesty. And it will be down upon us. We will pay this. When God, comes before us and, has to make a judgment, he'll remember that this is how, we handled one of our greatest sins. So one of the things, and this is just theoretical, one of the things that you notice, though, is you can trace the history of white people actually making the argument for reparations until roughly about 1820 or 1830. And what happens around 1820 or 1830 is you get this cotton boom in the South. And enslaved black people, the value of enslaved black people just shoots through the roof. Such to the point that by the time you get to 1860, there are 4 million enslaved black people in the South. And taken together, they're worth some $4 billion, a number that exceeds basically all of the assets, all the productive capacity, all the railroads, all the nascent factories, basically, all the banks, everything that we have in America put together is worth less than the enslaved black people in this country. And that's like I'm not saying that as a definite in terms of like when you see this reparations argument trail off among white people, but it's, subject for further study. And so what happens is after 1865, when black people are, when you get emancipation, it becomes a primarily black argument. Though not totally. You have like actually ex-Confederate officers with whole sorts of schemes for reparations, But then you have it becomes a black political tradition of asking for it. So I think the importance of that is to understand that this is not, something that, some crazy, woolly-eyed, radicals came up with in 1968 and suddenly decided. Because what people will say is, well, you should have, asked for it in 1865. Well, people did ask for it in 1865. The society was not structured such that, to grant that request. We have people on the record, asking for it. And the fact of the matter is the strategy of the state has always been to deny the request at the time, and then once those people die, to say, you know what, we should have paid it, but it's too late now. I mean, this is just a typical, it's a strategy of running out the clock. But I think it's important to know that this is not, an argument that begins in the 1960s. This is a very, very old argument in America.
Can you describe a bit about your own intellectual history with this idea? Anastasia mentioned your memoir earlier, The Beautiful Struggle, story of your growing up in West Baltimore. I'm wondering how you understood growing up the kind of relative position, economic position of whites and blacks in America, what the reasons were for it, and when it began to make sense to you that there was maybe some justice in a solution like this.
Right. So, I talked about this earlier, very, very early on in my life, and I think this is true for a lot of, black people. You understand the community that you live in is very, very different than at least America as it projects itself, out to the world on television. And you're clearly aware of that. I had the great, luxury and the great asset of having, fairly, well-read parents, who, and I have a lot of books in my house. So you get some sense that, okay, this is related to racism. If you wanted to understand why you live a certain way and why other folks live a certain way, you get the answer, racism. Or in the crudest speech, in some of our houses, you get the white man. That's like the argument, And I can remember being a kid trying to picture, like, the white man. What's that look like? Like, it's just like one white man, literally, like, like sketching, okay, black people are gonna live over here, white people. Like, what does that mean, But in black communities, that's what people say, oh, the white man ain't gonna let you have a white man. White man, wow. And there were no white people in my neighbors. I didn't know any white people. So I didn't know like that was a physical. I have like that as a very strong memory, like wondering, is that an individual person? But what you have to do, you get that answer, and then as you get older, and if you're curious, that doesn't quite like totally add up. And people tell you things like they say, well, the entire country, is built on your back. It's built on taking things from you. They ripped you off, and that's, rhetorical. And I'm not mocking that because, what became clear later to me was that reflects some deep, intuitive sense of the truth, even if you can't, connect all the dots. You have some sense of what happened. And so, as I, grew older and I, went off, to school and, studied the problem even more, I actually moved away from reparations, because there's this tendency in, these institutions of higher education and, just in exploration, just to try to complicate everything, which I think is a good impulse, but sometimes it ain't that complicated, man. Sometimes it's just, you took that from that person and that, it's just math. It's just 1 + 1. But there's like this tendency, and this is good. I don't think this is bad. Like, I don't think it's a bad phase. But they said, well, have you accounted for class? And, have you thought about this? And then, how does gender figure into this? And that's good. You should ask those questions. Please don't take that the wrong way. You should, but a lot of times you ask those questions, and I went through that phase over and over. Well, maybe it doesn't account for this. Maybe it was that. Maybe it's this. Maybe there was a system, over here. And what do you think about poor whites in Appalachia? You go through all of those phases of trying to figure it out, right? And then you come back, and what you end up with, even if you say it in some, more sophisticated ways, you end up with the white man. That's what you come back to it. Now, you don't say it like that, right? That's not how you say it. Because that's not what it is. But, that guy who, when you were 8 years old, was like, you've been ripped off. He built it all on your back. You say, damn, he was right. But it's good because you went through all those phases. You have the science, right? And you can, cite studies and dates, and you get figures, and you can put, all of this mathematics behind what was just intuitive before. And that, just makes it, really, really stronger. But I tell you, that was deeply, deeply chastening to me, to come back to some truths. I was raised around a very, very radical, black nationalist tradition. And, as I got older, there was a strong impulse to interrogate that and subject it to as much rigor as I could. And, I would not have predicted this, say, 15 years ago. But the fact of the matter is what happened was you ended up coming back to that the science itself ultimately brought you back, not to all of the conclusions, not to all of them, but certainly to some of them, certainly to reparations, and I did that, I would not, say that I was, I can't tell you that, I was always on board with that. I can't tell you that it's very nice that, the article has reached, masses of people. But the thing that really, really humbles me is there were some people who did not need to read Making a Second Ghetto, who did not need to make 5 visits to North Lawndale, who did not, need to, go through all of this, rigmarole, that I needed, to reach, a basic essential truth about what had happened.
Do you have a clearer picture now of what this white man actually looks like?
No, because I think, you got to think about that some sort of metaphorical sense. It's the way of using a person, to implicate an entire system, I think, or to represent an entire system. But yeah, it was a very interesting point. I think in my mind, I picture Ronald Reagan. That's like I think of Ronald. But you know what I think that is, though? I think that's just because, actually, in fact, I think that's just because Reagan was president through the period in which I was hearing those words. You know what I mean? So for the early period of my life when my family and the friends of my parents would say things like that, Reagan was the president. And so it's like an immediate association with that in my mind. It's not even policy based. You can make that association too, but I think a lot of it is just being a child during that period.
Can you categorize reactions to this piece? What kind of feedback have you gotten? There was immense reaction in the moment and subsequent weeks. You've been out talking about it some since then. Well, actually, a good deal, and continue to write about it.
Right.
And so, young, old, white, black, male, female, how would you describe what kind of patterns you've seen and how people react to this argument?
Well, so for me, the most interesting and I would argue the most gratifying has been African Americans who are above the age of say 60 or so. Because they have direct experience with this, and I share some of this, with you. You get letters from people's children or from the people themselves, and they say that was me, that that happened, and that has not simply come from Chicago. That's been a national outpouring. That is gratifying in the sense that folks got their story told, and that pleases me a great deal. Across the board for African Americans, again, there was this intuitive sense that somebody did something to us and they owe us. Now, I can't give you, all the math on that. I can't, outline how the system happened, but I'm gonna tell you, I know this ain't a mistake, and I know that I'm not crazy. And so for a lot of people, I think for a lot of African Americans, the feeling has been reassuring almost. I was not crazy. So I think that's been one thing. And I think, again, in the way that the Atlantic did it, you can look at the article, but then you can actually physically see the maps. I think it's just so jarring. It's not even really hard. This doesn't, again, this is 1 + 1. Redlined was here. That's where we lived. This is what the policy was. And we have so many quotes. Just to have the
actual requirements for who you couldn't give a mortgage to.
Right. And they're right there. Yeah. Or quotes from, say, the trade organization. At one point we got the trade organization, very explicitly saying, here's who you should not sell to in white neighborhoods. You shouldn't sell, to, a madam. You shouldn't sell to, a drug dealer, whatever, ne'er-do-well, a thief. And you shouldn't sell to a black person, of means who thinks that,
with a college degree, who thinks
who thinks that they have a right to improve themselves or something like that. Yeah, and so it's clear. That's just 1 + 1, man. And I think all our talk about implicit racism and trying to, read things into things and, things not, has blinded us to how much of that is so real. So I think for folks to see that, it's it says, well, yeah, I wasn't crazy. And then, there's been a reaction from white people, which has been really, really interesting to me, who just come up and say, I just didn't know. That's just the main, I didn't know. How did this happen? I had no idea. Or somebody will say, I had this conversation just a few weeks ago. Somebody says, I grew up in this neighborhood, not here in Chicago, but a particular neighborhood. I think the woman was from Milwaukee. And she said, and I was friends with a little black girl, and her dad was a doctor. And I remember going to her house and wondering why her dad was a doctor and they lived in that neighborhood. And I didn't understand why they didn't live in a neighborhood like we lived in. And that just sort of, going over and then you just go on with your day, right? It just gnaws on you and you keep going. And then to see it, laid out, I think, it was quite shocking, for a lot of people, whether they bought the case for reparations or not, but to see the actual policy, I think is just pretty undeniable.
Explain the white reaction a little bit more. You mean, thank you, I now understand how the world looks through your eyes, or thank you, I now understand why?
I think it's now I understand my country a little better. Yeah. It's mostly stunned. Like it's a kind of stunned, oh my God, this really happened thing.
But is it also that now I understand why this set of issues will not go away? Like
maybe, I'm not sure. Actually, I'm not sure. Maybe. The thing that sticks with me is just the sheer. Like folks are astounded. Like they're just astounded, and I think a lot of that is because we think about okay, so yes, I knew slavery was brutal. Okay, fine, I knew that, and yes, I knew Jim Crow was brutal. Yes, I knew that, but I didn't know that rolled into that was the denial of where people could buy their homes, and a kind of intentional denial of people's ability to build wealth, and then having done that, setting them out in such a way so that people could take from the wealth that they had built. I just think, a lot of people just didn't know. A lot of people just didn't know. I mean, again, like I had the intuitive sense. I had some sense of redlining, but when you see people, actually say things, it's tough. I mean, the case that, with the contract buyers league, when you see the foreman of the jury walk out, after the case, goes against the contract buyers league and say, explicitly say to a newspaper, we hope that this will help, right all the nonsense that, began with Brown versus the board. It's like, Jesus. I mean, what am I supposed to do with that? That don't require reading no tea leaves right there. And to have it, just be one, it is. It's a little astounding. And so I think, for a lot of folks, that was tough.
I'm going to open it up to you guys in just a minute. I have a couple more questions. I wonder what you think. You had occasion to sit down a couple of times with the president, and I wonder what and this is terribly unfair, it's hypothetical on so many levels and so forth and so on. What do you think he makes of this argument?
Wow. I don't know. I don't know. And I legitimately don't know. I haven't, none of those occasions have come after that piece came out, that's for sure. Yeah. I've been invited back after that. But I don't think that's why. But half is okay. I don't think that's why. Listen, I think the president is like really, really intelligent. Like, this is just really, really intelligent. And I think, it's tough to deny the math there. I think it's like really, really hard to fix your mind to say, no, nothing is owed. I think that's extremely, extremely difficult. Now, you can, maybe say, well, here's why I can't pay, although I think that's difficult too. But I like to think, he would at least acknowledge the debt. Having said that, he's in a very difficult position, I think, because it's what it's your private self, right? But you weren't elected to be your private self. You were elected to represent the United States of America. I was watching, the president after, it was one of these press conferences after Ferguson, and, people like me, we sit there and we parse, every public statement that he makes and where he got it right and where we felt he got it wrong. But it's like after Ferguson, to ask, Barack Obama, he's in his, I guess, 6th year at that point, the president to analyze it. I mean, what do you want the president of the United States to say, man? Do you want me to say to you that, listen, the folks who live there are the result of policies that this country passed. And the reason why that boy was left laying on the concrete for 4 hours is a direct reflection about how this country feels about black people and how it's treated black people for the entirety of their residency here in the United States. Why are you surprised? Did the president say that? He can't say that. Your president can't say that. He can't. And, I felt like, and, I don't want to mind read here, but it must be fatiguing, to have to, prod the country forward. At the same time, understanding certain things that you must understand privately, and not really, really being able to go there. So, watching, I just felt like it was just this sort of fatigue, like, okay, folks, what do you want me to say here, man? What do you really, what do you actually want me to say about this? I don't know. Maybe one day I'll find out,
He has made the argument that there's a very different strain in the discourse around race in America that you've written about a lot.
Right.
Let's go back to Booker T. Washington,
right,
and even
right.
before that, of self-reliance.
Right.
And that this isn't about, don't expect this to get given to you, don't expect the debt to be paid, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You quote Mayor Michael Nutter in the piece saying, pull up your pants and buy a belt.
Literally buy a belt, yeah.
do you sense a change in the rhetoric now, or first of all, what's wrong with that approach?
Well, so I think there are two ways of looking at that do for self approach. There are people who have no interest, frankly, in the African American struggle and in African American people, period. Who are just looking to not have to take a hard look at history, and so they say things like that, and they say, "What is the past? It doesn't matter." So that's one group. I think within the African American community, and I'm kin to some of these people, there's a very, very different strain, which is yes, we do recognize that. That's definitely true. Yes, something really is old. Yes, you did get ripped off, but it's a much more I don't want to say cynical. Let's say pragmatic way of looking at it. It says, what makes you think these people are going to do anything for you? Like, in your right mind, what makes you think, what piece of history, what piece of evidence are you able to furnish to say that some critical mass of white people in this country will realize that you are owed something and in good faith make an effort to pay it back? If I may be so bold, Mr. Ross, yesterday we had this thing at North Lawndale, and Mr. Ross has his own critique of reparations, which I'm sure he would give. And one of the things he said yesterday, we said, listen, if you get reparations, you better make sure you have a different court system. You better make sure you have a different educational system. You better make sure you got a different media. You basically better make sure you got a different society. These are not people who are in denial about the fact of racism and are not, in denial about, the fact of an actual debt. The problem is, so I have a great degree of respect, for that. I think that's what my dad would say. My dad would say, no, but this is what my dad, because me and my father have had this debate for years now. The problem I have with that, though, is if you accept the humanity of black people, if you accept that black people, will fall down, that black people, because they're human, because there are 40 million of us, that, to expect a group of 40 million people to be twice as good, as an actual pragmatic strategy, is to effectively expect them to be superhuman. We don't expect, white people to be superhuman. And if you accept that black people are human, you have to accept that they probably can't be superhuman, that they can't be superhuman. That is the definition of being human. The mediocrity is part of being human is not some, beautiful, experience, written in pastels and flowers. Part of that is your mediocrity. That's part of being human, your ordinariness. And if you, bring that analysis to black people, that, sometimes we are just as lazy as the next person. Sometimes, we fall down just like the next person, and there's nothing exceptional in our laziness. There's nothing exceptional in our falling downness. The strategy for twice as good ultimately can't work. And it can't work because black people are here because of the humanity. I think that's great advice if you're talking to your child. I think that's great advice if you're talking to your children. I think it's great advice if you were talking to a group of young people, about how they need to individually exceed, because I think, you can have a conversation about how each of us at the end of the day is ultimately responsible for the flourishing of our own bodies, for the protection of our own bodies. We have to do all we can, to protect our own bodies. And even, if the odds seem, completely against us, you don't really have the luxury of quitting. I think that's one conversation that can be had. When you get to a policy level, and I would, make this critique, not only when you get to a policy level, when you are the head of state, you are the titular representative of America and American heritage, and everything that, America has thus ever done to black people. I think you forego the right to stand up and tell people, listen, ultimately, this is when you pull your pants up. Because you're the representative of why they got to pull up their pants in the first place. You are a representative of the reason why, these folks have to be twice as good in the first place. The president, says, and I think if he would say, I'm speaking as an African American, who's, been through this experience. That's the place I'm speaking from. I'm not, necessarily speaking as, head of state. But see, the problem with that is when asked for policy, specifically directed towards black people, the answer is, I am, and the answer has been, I am president of the entire United States. Well, I agree with that. I agree with that. And thus, you must be critiqued as the president of the entire United States. And part of that is legacy, part of that is heritage, part of that is the practices. When the president of the United States goes every Memorial Day, and talks about, the sacrifices, of the American, military, he's invoking the heritage of this country. When the President of the United States, talks about Abraham Lincoln, when he goes to Springfield, as he did to inaugurate his campaign, he's invoking heritage. This is heritage too, man. This is why heritage ain't just the thing that flatters you. And so I think, those of us, who, admire, the president, who respect the president, who think, the president is, just, carrying quite a bit, still have a responsibility to critique that. And so, as much as I, admire that philosophy, and as much as I very much grew up on that philosophy, I'm a product of that philosophy, as a policy, because Black people are human, because Black people are part of the country, I don't know how that works as a national policy, of self-liberation. We're part of this. We're part of this. We were ripped off. That is the immediate reason for why, we're in this condition. And as hard as the answer, might be to, affect, and, given the fact that the answer might not and probably won't be affected in our lifetime, in our kids' lifetime, maybe not even in our grandkids' lifetime, that does not, forego us, give us the right to look away. I mean, one of the things, I'm sorry, I get going on this a little bit, but one of the things, and I'll cut it off after this, I'm sorry for this long, lengthy answer, but one of the things I think about is if we look at the Black community today, right, and again, starting from the premise of humanism, and you say, well, part of the problem is we have not taken, we have not done all that we can do. We haven't, been, twice, we've fallen down on the job, we've done X, Y, and Z. Well, if you accept that we are as human as other previous generations, then, well, man, you got to look back to the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement when they were executing Black people in Mississippi, in Alabama. Did that generation not do as much as it was supposed to do? Is that a critique that we would make of them? When we look at the era of political leadership in Black people during the Red Summers, during the era of lynching at the turn of the century, and say, you know what, those people were too lazy. They could have done more. When we look at enslaved Black people in the 1830s and the 1840s and say, why didn't you fight harder? Why didn't you rebel? Why didn't you go? If you had rebelled, we wouldn't have ended up in there. Had you been superhuman, had you been twice as good, you could have overthrown slavery on your own through your sheer will. We would never do that. That'd be totally, totally disrespectful. And so my argument is that, we should show the same respect that we show for ancestors, for the community that came before us, for our young people. That they deserve that exact, same respect. And so I just think, I think that idea has to be interrogated and has to be critiqued, even being sympathetic to where it comes from.
All right, let's open it up to questions from the audience. I'd actually like to reinforce Steve's admonition at the outset that please ask your question in the form of a question and a short question to preserve as much time as we can for others to ask questions.
Hi, thank you. This question is coming from the DCU Chicago Alumni Club Watch Party. In the months since writing your piece, is there anything you would change or update? Have you seen any progress in reparations as a result of your piece? Thank you.
I mean, I haven't seen any progress. But that also, I also wouldn't, it's not my, it's outside of the realm of a writer to do that. My job is then to move on to next and to not, sit here too long. I can't. I wrote the piece. I hope there are people who have been fighting for reparations for a very, very long time. I hope the piece gives them some ammo. There are activists who've been dealing with this for a very, very long time. I hope it gives them some ammo, to go out and, do what needs to be done. But as a writer, I sort of have to keep going, and other lines, down the question. There's not much about the piece I would change. The hope is that, in the reporting that I do going forward, it enhances, it asks other questions that are related, to that piece.
Next question.
Hi, I have a question from Chloe, who's watching from our overflow room. You talk about reparations being the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. What steps do you imagine our country taking to achieve this? What can we do to move in this direction?
Well, I don't, I think the first big thing is I outline in the piece, and people, they hate the small, most basic answers. You can urge whatever congressional district you live in. John Conyers introduces H.R. 40, which is a bill to study reparations to study the effects of enslavement and its subsequent legacy on African Americans and assess this question of whether Black people deserve reparations. You can urge your congressman to support H.R. 40. And this is, not a small thing. This is not a small thing at all. An accounting has to be made. A study has to be made. This is exactly the way that the struggle for Japanese American reparations went for internment. There was a study. There was an assessment made of the damage. And then, Ronald Reagan, the white man, the symbolic white man, signed a bill. It gave, reparations to Japanese Americans who were interned. I think the exact same political process needs to happen to other, for other people. There are people, also, who are in the activist community, for example, with the group in Cobra, who have been pushing a more internationalist, approach. And that really is, their vein. I think you can look up at some of the activists, for example, in Cobra, who've been pursuing this for years and look at what strategies they're pursuing. You can support that. So I think that there are a range of things. The basic recommendation I get, is to immediately get behind HR 40. But I wouldn't be contained to that. I wouldn't be restrained with that.
Thank you. I'd like to know, ideally, what reparations would look like to you if you had complete control over it, whether it's cash or policy, education reform, and then what the impact of that would be 10, 20, 50 years down the road.
Well, if I had complete control of it, it wouldn't really be reparations. That's part of the problem. I mean, I think people imagine reparations happening in the current political system as it is today. So, one of the discussions we give, we'll say, there was a check cut right now to, black people for, I don't know, $50,000 a piece, whatever you're going to say. What would that effect, be right now? But see, you have to envision, you have to understand how America thinks about racism in black people right now, right? And the predominant idea is pretty much pull your, that was in the past, that was a long time ago, right? A world in which HR 40 gets to the House floor, a world in which, there's a partnership for HR 40, in the Senate, and a world where, a president actually gets behind that and you have actual hearings. That is a very, very different America. It's a completely different America. It's an America with a totally different perspective on its history. It's a very, America with a very, totally different, perspective on black people. And in that world, what would reparations be? So I see it as a, and folks may differ with me on this, but I see it as an essentially democratic process. Because if that doesn't happen and you just cut a check, we've learned nothing. We've learned nothing at all. Nothing will actually, necessarily change. But in a world where reparations does happen, I think, what you have is a broad commitment to fix what happened in the past. So that may, take the form of, deliberately, giving somebody a check. I think about Mr. Clyde Ross, and I think, give Mr. Clyde Ross a check right now, right? Like, you could just do that. That's something that should be done. And just to, to make this, knowable, to put this in, a knowable frame. Look, we have the maps for, where redlining took place. We have census reports. We know who lived where. We could set up a process right now, for folks who were, sent into, situations with loans, that were predatory because of redlining. We can, set up a situation right now for folks who can say, listen, I tried to access certain things through the GI Bill and I was denied. Now that's not a radical option, but that's like a narrow cast thing that's doable right now, in terms of, folks that, have been ripped off that we know about. I'm not arguing that it should be limited to that. But, we do have those starting points. But I think, a time when you get to that level, it's a totally different America. And it's not just a matter of sending out checks. If you study, like the reparations that Germany gave, in the piece we talk about them giving reparations to Israel, but that wasn't the end of it. That was the start of it. The process continues even up till today. Now, we're talking about, going back to 1619. How long will that take? How long will it take to make that right? But a country that gets into the mode of reparation, I think is would be committed to that long process. It's a different America. It's a very different America where that happens.
Hi. So I have two questions that are actually associated. One is, are you thinking about writing a book? And two is, what's the next step in after you experience the shocked white person who's like, I had no idea. So then there has to be a next step that involves education of somehow, and how do you imagine that continuing?
Yeah, I'm working on edits for a book right now. I'm sorry, so I should, God willing, the manuscript will be done by the end of the year. it's kind of rooted in some of the stuff, but it's not. It's not like the case for reparations blown out in the book. It's something a little different. I don't know what happens after that. You know, I don't know where a shocked white person goes after, you know, realizing that this was something that happened. I mean, that really is for shocked white person to decide. You know, I mean, are you gonna, you know, just be shocked? And you know, and I'm not, you know, like there's a kind of shock. Well, I didn't know that happened, and then you just continue on with your day, right? But you like to think that people will keep reading. You know, you like to think that people will, you know, to pursue, you know, their education and will not, you know, stop with the Atlantic and will go on. As a writer, that's beyond my control. You know, I try to play my position. I do my part. You know, and I hope that folks continue, you know, self-educate. You know, I always, you know, try to be very clear about the resources I use to educate myself. You know, and I hope that people follow up.
We're here to have a question on this side of the room.
Hi. So there's an advocacy group in Chicago called the Anti-Eviction Campaign that works to repossess.
The anti-what?
The Anti-Eviction Campaign that works to repossess abandoned houses by occupying them. What do you think about this, and do you think this could be incorporated into reparations in any way?
Well, it's the first time I'm hearing about it, so I'm not really qualified to give an informed opinion, regrettably. Yeah, I try to keep my feet underneath me, man, when I throw a punch. So, I don't want to, you know, get out there. That doesn't mean that, you know, what they're doing is, you know, unjust or just or anything like that. It's just that I just don't know. I just don't know.
Hey, so I currently read essays for college seniors at Martin Luther King High School, and it's 92% black, but it's a very high-achieving high school, and so all the seniors are going to colleges with.
And it's a very high achievement,
yes. And a lot of the students are going to very prestigious universities with low black populations. And what do you have a word for the class of 2014 as to how to take black culture and pop culture to the university campus?
Yeah, I have great advice for them, and the advice is apply to Howard University. That's my advice, and I'm not being flip here. Here's what I'll say. My advice is to apply to Howard University and then go to those elite schools for grad school. That's my advice, and here's why I say that. It's impossible for me to imagine writing the case for reparations without having gone to a historically black school. And Howard in particular, but I would spread that out to HBCUs in general. The thing that HBCUs offer, and this happens because I'll come to talk at a school like this. So I'll be up at Cornell where I was, a few months ago, and a young lady said to me, she said, "How am I supposed to deal with the fact that people say I'm only here because of affirmative action?" And I answered the question, but the other thing I said is, listen, like. That has never, by the time that was my experience, I had gotten to the Atlantic. I was like, I was thoroughly formed. I never had that as a question in my head at all, that I had gotten here because out of some, sort of thing that somebody had done. Not that you should feel that way to begin with, but what I'm saying is that's a tough thing to face at 18. That's a hard thing for somebody to put on you at 18 when you're still trying to find yourself. Historically, black schools give African-American students a chance to sit back and assess themselves and confront their tradition in a semi-private space. It's not totally private space, but in a semi-private space. And that just allows for a range of debate and dialogue that is just beyond anything that I experienced after I left. It's one thing to have to confront your history, say here in mixed company, which is great. But sometimes we get defensive. We feel the need to defend ourselves against other people. Or the professor, who may not, be black says something, and you feel this need to defend yourself. And at Howard, that was like totally off the table. It freed people up to say, the things that, you really, really need to say. To talk seriously. One of the things I think about, and I'll just tell this story really quickly. Those of us who came to Howard, and were heavily influenced by Malcolm X, heavily influenced by black nationalism, felt this, real need to make ourselves human, and the way to make ourselves human was to prove that we had built things as advanced and as beautiful and as great as anything that white people had built. And that sent us on a chase for heroes. And one of the people that I think about was there's this woman who's a brilliant military strategist, Queen Nzinga, in what is now the Congo today. And there's a famous story that I remember reading about. And she's going in to negotiate with the Dutch, who are trying to take from her. And they want to disrespect her. So what they do is they don't give her a chair, right? And she immediately orders one of her servants to sit down and basically get on all fours. And she uses this woman as a stool. And this story is told, and it's true, to show, like the craftiness of Nzinga, about how she wouldn't be disrespected. And I read about that, and it made me feel really proud and everything. You go out there and say, yeah, we got brilliant people too. And you go someplace like Howard, right? And that's cool, but like the need to assert your self-esteem is not the same. You don't really need it because everybody around you is black. It's clear. Brilliance of black people is right there. There's no, real argument about that. And then, man, we got to breaking that story down. And we got to thinking about like what enslavement actually was and how it was actually the loss of your body and how like if you really get on a human level and you want to understand your condition as the descendants of slaves, you have much more in common with the woman who was used as a chair than you do with Queen Nzinga. And that was like a profound moment for me. It was like a deep sort of realization that I could not have made within frankly a white space. The opportunity to interrogate that and to interrogate yourself and to subject yourself to the harshest possible rigor. And then at the end of it, come out feeling like you're all right. Saul Bellow had written this thing at the time that just greatly, greatly disturbed me. He wrote, assessing, black diaspora. He said, who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus? And I went on this, I said, I gotta find the Tolstoy of the Zulus. Who is the Tolstoy? There must be a Tolstoy of the Zulus, right? And just doing, this reading at Howard, I came across this brilliant Ralph Wiley essay. And Ralph Wiley replies and says, this was like the most liberating thing I'd ever read. He says, Tolstoy is the Tolstoy of the Zulus. And I thought, damn. Wow. Oh, like the whole, gambit was wrong. Like you can't even accept the premise. That, sort of realization, that sort of interrogation for me, for what I need was only possible, in a black space. So I think, regrettably, this is no disrespect to, elite institutions. I think, though, for black people, it's essential at that young age to have that room to interrogate yourself, to look at yourself. And then after that, you can go out and see the world. The world's going to be majority white anyway. You got plenty of time. You got plenty of time to go to Yale, Harvard, Princeton. You got plenty of time for that. But at that crucial point, I'm a big believer in HBCUs. I'm going through this with my son right now. Yeah.
You touched on this in your piece and in your talk right now, that essentially when people hear reparations, the immediate snap judgment is a check being mailed out to black people, essentially. Mm-hmm. And when you actually read your piece, it's clear that what you're asking for, when you make your case for reparations, for you reparations is a reckoning. It's much broader than that check. And yet, your piece...
a check is part of it. I always
a check is part of it.
Right.
But yet your piece is named The Case for Reparations, that very starkly. Was there ever any hesitation or ambivalence before the piece was published about putting that title on the front of it, and that it might turn away people who would otherwise be more willing to even engage the argument?
I don't think so. No, right?
We experimented with a couple of other possible headlines. I'm having trouble remembering what they were, but basically from the beginning, this was what we called the piece. And that was the only reason we hesitated at the last minute, because we just thought this had been our headline from the way we thought about the story through the editing process, and would it translate to the outside world? And we realized it would, so we went with it.
Yeah, no, there's very little. I think I told James this before. I always joke that people always, come up to me. I was telling James, and they say, "How'd you get that in the Atlantic?" Like black people, they always come up to me, and I always joke that I want to say, well, I had to tell them white folks we had to do X, Y, and Z, and they wasn't hearing me, and then we did this and that. But that's so not what happened. It's just not, that's not what happened.
The truth is I was on vacation.
No, I mean, the real truth is, I sent the pitch to, Scott Stasser, and he read the pitch and said, okay, and I'm assuming he took it to you, and folks were like, okay, so how are we going to do this? There was no internal, no resistance to, the presentation, to how we were going to do it, to the investment, to the resources, and I think as happy as I am about that, and the Atlantic, being willing to go there, I actually think it's illustrative, and I was talking to James about this earlier, one of the problems why we don't see more arguments like this is, by the time I had, pitched that, I had been, effectively writing for the Atlantic for about 4 or 5 years, so, we had a relationship. Very few African-American writers have those kind of relationships with, magazines at the Atlantic's level. That's just the truth of it. And I think that's more than people not being open, to the ideas, it's just the relationships ain't there, man. And there are reasons why the relationships aren't there. It's if you think about, how one breaks into the field of magazines, it's a very, very difficult, process. It's very, very difficult for people who, might be, in the first generation of folks that are going to college, for instance. Tell somebody you want to work for a magazine. There was happily, the Atlantic, internship is paid, but that, often is not the case for magazines. It certainly was not the case when I was coming up, so you're trying to break in by, either taking a really, really low paying job or, no money at all, and trying to live in a city like New York or DC, difficult. Very, 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 very difficult. And so I think, it's like good and bad news. I mean, the good news is, folks really, at least I'll speak for the Atlantic. I speak for the Atlantic. The Atlantic, as always, I've never had the feeling like, hey, I'm saying something crazy here and you guys aren't going to be open to it. I've never had that. At the same time, you do look around the landscape and see that there's so few people that actually get, to that point to have that relationship. And that's the problematic aspect of it.
One of the things that you brought up was the bootstrap mentality that seems to pervade everything. I'm one of those cynical old black men that you brought up in your talk. There was a study that Gallup did in the 50s that showed that 80% of white folks felt that black people had it just as good as white folks. And we hear the same thing now. So when we talk about this political landscape that we need to change, in order for reparations to even be a realistic conversation, how do we get white folks to the point to actually understand that we as black people really do know what we're talking about when we tell them something is wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love cynical old black people because what they do is, man, they bring the real. I mean, that's an actual question that has to be confronted. And I'm of, as you might observe, I have some conflict in my head about it myself. So I think the first thing is, if you're going to work within the political process, if you're going to make a decision, that you're not going to go out and get guns and try to, overthrow something. If you're going to work within the political process, there has to be, a political solution. And I don't know how you get around the fact that it's massive, massive debt. It's huge. I mean, you can see it represented in the wealth gap, but I suspect that doesn't even capture everything. I think we're at the point where for every, nickel of wealth an African-American family has, a white family has $1. And that's the rough approximation of the wealth gap. That doesn't even completely cover it. As we talk about in the piece, there's a level of neighborhood poverty that black people experience. So if you are an African-American family that, makes around $100,000 a year, you tend to live in a neighborhood where people make about $30,000 a year. So you may, on the income level, look like a relatively rich black family, but you live in housing that is comparable to a lower middle class white family. These are tremendous like hurdles that have to be dealt with. And as much as I would like to believe in the bootstrapping, I don't think it gets us there. Here's an even more distressing thought. I strongly suspect that much of what happens in history is outside of the direct control of human beings. And what I mean by that, or the direct intention of human beings. Okay, so if you were an enslaved black person in 1820, you could look all the way back through your lineage, all the way back to 1619, see nothing but enslaved black people. Beyond that, if you had economic knowledge of what was going on, you could see the rising value of black people. And you could look forward and see that your kids were going to be enslaved too. There was every reason to believe that for the rest of your life and for the rest of your children's life and for the rest of your grandchildren and great-grandchildren's lives, you would be enslaved. I mean, you take it from that perspective. That would have been the pragmatic thing to think at that point. And yet people stood up and said this was wrong. So you get to a point where you're talking about like 1855, 1858, around that period. You get somebody like, say Frederick Douglass, just to pick one person. And he's saying, The just policy, the thing this country must immediately do is it must liberate 4 million black people who are living in the South. No questions asked. And you ain't shipping them off to Africa. Let them right there. It's their land. They worked it. They deserve it just as much as anybody else. And people think Frederick Douglass is out of his mind. How's that going to happen? Have you looked at the worth of what black people, represent to this country? The largest concentration of multimillionaires in this country are living in the Mississippi River Valley. Not in New York, not in Chicago, not in Boston. Mississippi River Valley, man. The largest export of this country in 1860, the time of the Civil War, is cotton. 60% of our exports is cotton. Slavery is that intrinsic. Who would have counted on white slaveholders overplaying their hand? Because that's what they did. I mean, that's what they did. They just took it too far. They just, kind of lost their minds. And ended up proving Frederick Douglass right. So that 7 years later, 7 years before people were saying, Frederick, you crazy. And 7 years later, he looks like a prophet. Because of the events of history. 1860, Douglass is telling people, listen, the immediate and just thing is to, give black people guns and let them fight for their freedom in the war. People are telling Douglass, you are crazy. White people who are in charge of things, Abraham Lincoln on is saying, man, we don't know what these black people are going to do with these guns. They might shoot themselves. They might shoot us. We have no idea what's going to happen. Emancipation Proclamation comes out and people ignore this. They focus on, the idea of freeing people. But the real deal is that the Emancipation Proclamation is a military order and it immediately orders guns to be given to black people so that they can fight on their own behalf. And so by the time you get to Petersburg, in 1865, you're talking about, something like 1 in 10, soldiers at Petersburg, and the number might even be higher, are African American. They're fighting for something that no one would have predicted at the onset of the war. What happened? What happened? Well, they thought they were going to be able to wrap the war up quick. Who would have counted on General McClellan being so bad? Who would have counted on that? Who would have counted on, the Southern generalship being so good and these folks fighting, for dear life to the end. So events that were outside of our control. This goes down to the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, one of the things that, we appreciate the bravery of Dr. Martin Luther King. We appreciate the bravery of the Freedom Riders and all of those folks. But what people don't talk about is America had a problem at that point. And the problem was people were using Jim Crow as a weapon in the Cold War. And we had just had, this fight, in World War II with Nazism to see, the logical ends of what racism was, the extermination, of an entire group of people. America had a serious, serious problem. How could it preach about, liberty, in Russia, and still have, what was going on down in the South? Now, listen, the activists took great advantage of that. You know what I mean? They did. But the situation itself was outside of their control. I say that to say, I think the job, of folks in our situation is to say the right thing and to wait for our opportunity. And the opportunity is out of our control. Who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what's going to happen? But it just like, folks in 1820, when it looked crazy to say, the real just thing is to emancipate all of us, did not stop trying to say the right thing. I don't think that's a reason to not say the right thing right now.
I'm afraid only one more question, and that's, you have the microphone, sir.
And I'm not letting it go. Keep this going for as long as I want. No. So this question's gonna change, I guess. It's different from the other questions in that I want to pose a little challenge. I appreciate the article. And I think it's great. That obviously means I'm going to say but one thing that I had trouble with is just the place that Native Americans don't occupy in it. And I know that you say academics, I'm not necessarily an academic, but you say there's a tendency to overcomplicate things, and I think I don't want to do that, but I think it's an important thing to think about when we're talking about land, right? When we're talking about Black people taking up land in this country, and we trace the story back to 1619, what if we went back to 1492 and thought about that in terms of reparations? I mean, what should that do to the argument as far as making a case for this for Black people when, Native Americans have not just undergone genocide historically, but one of the primary ways that they were argued they had disappeared, disappearance theory is a subset of Native American studies, one of the primary arguments was that they had diluted their blood by intermixing with black people specifically. So when you look at these kinds of things and you wrote these into the history of not just Native American people, but black people, there's a confluence, there's a convergence of stories that I think necessitates that we not just reside in the black-white binary as far as how we look at reparations, but look at how we understand this on a larger, more long-term scale. Sorry, I don't mean to go long. My question is simply, how do you rope that longer history into this case?
Right. So, this is a case for reparations. I hope it's not the last article on reparations. It shouldn't be the last word. I think in progressive circles, there's always this search, and it's a good search, for coalitions to see how we relate to other people, how things are interconnected, and you just explain the history of how we could see that. Having said that, I believe that the black experience is a particular thing, and I believe that the black people have a right. Let me change that. It's not even so much black people have a right. I think the history of itself is worthy of examination in and of itself by itself. And I don't think that that means that there's not a case for reparations for Native Americans. But I have the right, I keep saying right, I have a right to study black people. I have a right to think about that in and of itself. Just like, one could make the same critique of an argument, for example, reparations that were given to Israel after the Holocaust. Well, Jews weren't the only people that were killed in the Holocaust, but folks have a right to talk about that. And then there should be, another article, about the Roma killed in the Holocaust. And there should be another article about, homosexuals who were killed in the Holocaust. Just like there should be another article about reparations for Native Americans. This should, I think one of the things that we mistake is because sometimes there's not a lot of bandwidth for a certain story, we try to put everything on one story. You know what I mean? This is one story, man. This is just one story. And I did my best to research the hell out of it. Most of it is not actually rooted, in that period for the most part. It's talking about housing. And I think, we have the right to reside in that space, to talk about our experience as an independent, separate field worthy of study. And somebody else should write, frankly, somebody else better informed, somebody else who's, thought about this question all of their life should write the case for Native American reparations. I can't wait to read it, And I'm not being flip, I'm not being cynical. I literally mean that. I literally mean that, because the flip side of that is if I say that, if I say, African American history and reparations as a concept specifically relating to black people is worthy of that, in-depth study. Native American history is worth the same thing, and it should be given the same thing. It shouldn't be an adjunct to my thing. It shouldn't be attached on just to make sure, that I'm, intersectional enough. That ain't really the way to do it. I think there's some value in focusing, and going as deep as you possibly can, in a specific area. And my hope is that folks who have thought, about Native American history will look at that piece and will derive something from it. Just like, when I, went to do my research, on reparations, given to Israel, I was able to see certain things about reparations in terms of black people. Just when I did, the research that was, behind it in terms of reparations given to Japanese, I was able to see certain things and borrow it from that. So my hope is that, this will not be the end of the argument. It shouldn't be. This should not be the end. Folks should look at that, and then they should go and do that same amount of research. So that's it.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Ta-Nehisi, very much.
Thank you.
Please join me in a warm round of applause for Ta-Nehisi Coates, for James Bennett. Thank you so much for that conversation. I know it's coming to a close, but I hope tonight's furthered the conversation. It's not just concluded it. Join me in thanking as well our partners tonight, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, International House and the Global Voices Series, and the National Public Housing Museum. Thank you all so much for being here. We hope to see you back here very soon for another IOP event. Thanks again.